Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's Talking Biopolitics conversation. Today we're going to be seeing a trailer of and talking about a very amazing and wonderful documentary just released called Surviving Eugenics, and we'll be talking with one of the filmmakers, Rob Wilson, and with Milton Reynolds of Facing History and Ourselves. Before we begin, I have a few introductory things and housekeeping things to tell you about. This is Marcy Darnofsky, that's the first thing, from the Center for Genetics and Society. And then we'll launch into the program. I want to let you know that the event is being recorded, and you'll be able to view it or tell your friends and colleagues about it afterwards. It will be on YouTube. And I also wanted to let you know that you can submit your comments and questions at any point in the conversation, and we really urge you to do that because we really want to bring you into this conversation. So the way to do it is that Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. You can just type your questions in there. We're also going to be tweeting this event, and the hashtag is Talking Biopolitics. Hashtag Talking Biopolitics. So please feel free to jump in on that aspect of the conversation as well. Okay, so let's get started with a couple of introductory slides that we have. We wanted to let you know that we've been doing these Talking Biopolitics conversations for a couple years now with leading thinkers about a whole range of issues having to do with the social meanings and the social implications of human genetic technologies and assisted reproductive technologies. So all these conversations are archived on the CGS YouTube channel, and you can see some of the conversations that we've had with really quite amazing writers, filmmakers, scholars, advocates, activists. So here's one batch, then we have even more here. All these are available to you. And finally, the earliest ones that we started with in, I think, 2012 or 13, all are available. And we'll be sending you links to these and all the other information that we talked about after the event today. So a few words about the Center for Genetics and Society. Our mission is to work for responsible uses and effective governance of human genetic and reproductive technologies. And we come to these issues through a lens that really tries to focus on their implications for these values: social justice, human rights, ecological integrity, the common good, and democratic governance. So those are the criteria that we use as we assess developments in genetic and assisted reproductive technology. We do this in a number of ways. We work in these overlapping program categories to build a network of advocates and scholars across a range of disciplines, advocates across a range of sectors who share more or less our concerns. We don't all need to be on the same page of the book, but we are kind of all on the same chapter of the book. Moving around the circles there, we carefully select policy situations where we think that we can have an impact. We do undertake some advocacy-oriented research to fill the many gaps in what's known about the effects and implications and experience of these technologies, practices of these technologies. And finally, we have a pretty robust communications program, both online and with the traditional media. So that's what the Center for Genetics and Society pretty much does. Let's see, I did want to tell you that the next Talking Biopolitics conversation will be with Nathaniel Comfort interviewing Paul Nussler about Paul's new book, which is about to be released. Its title is GMO Sapiens, the Life-Changing Science of Designer Babies. And Paul is in that book really for he's a working scientist, but in that book he's examining for a lay audience the what's going on now with the gene editing technologies that could enable heritable human genetic modification, and the possibilities and the pitfalls of what he says is altering life as we know it today. Paul is a professor at UC Davis School of Medicine, and Nathaniel is on the faculty at the Institute of the History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. And we'll be doing that Talking Biopolitics conversation the week of January 11th at the same time of day as this, and we'll be sending all of you information about that, so look out for it, please. So I think at this point we are ready to jump into our program. And so Rob and Milton, can I ask you to please share your webcams so that we can all see you? Okay, great. All right, we're all here. Okay, so welcome to you. We've got a great audience of participants in this conversation, and we really do want you to be participants, folks, again, so please do, as things come up as you're listening to Rob and Wilson, submit your questions and comments. But first, let me introduce the two of you. Rob is professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Alberta up in Canada, the area we're going to be talking about today, and he's the founding director of Philosophy for Children Alberta. His areas of specialization include philosophy of mind and cognitive science, philosophy of biology, and disability studies. He's the author or editor of 6 books, and the book projects he's currently working on are one book on eugenics and another on kinship. And very closely related to what we're going to be talking about today, Rob was the team leader of a really amazing project called Living Archives on Eugenics in Western Canada. And that project ran from 2010 until this year. And its aim was to investigate the many aspects of the eugenics movement in Western Canada. And as I hope we'll get into, part of the one of the products of that effort was an online resource, eugenicsarchive.ca. And another was the documentary that we're going to be focusing on today, Surviving Eugenics, which, believe it or not, and you'll have a hard time believing when you see the film, is Rob's first venture into the world of filmmaking. So, Rob, welcome.
It's great to be here, Matt.
And Rob will be in conversation with Milton Reynolds. Milton is a longtime colleague of CGS. He is Senior Program Associate at Facing History and Ourselves, which is an international organization working with high school teachers to help them engage their students in examining racism, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. Milton has been particularly interested in the American eugenics movement in his work with Facing History. And before joining Facing History, he was a middle school teacher. He's been a diversity and communications consultant, a curriculum design specialist, and he has over 25 years of counseling experience. He also serves as vice chair of the San Mateo Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Commission. He's the current governing board chair for the organization Literacy for Environmental Justice, which is an environmental justice and youth development nonprofit. And he's on the board of the Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State University. So thank you so much, Milton, and welcome.
We sat on the grass with paper and a pencil, and she drew the picture of a circle and 2 fallopian tubes on that circle, in that circle. And she put 2 lines across each of the fallopian tubes, and she said, they're cut and tied, simply cut and tied. That's it. That's how you're sterilized.
I was marched up to the main building, and they had a board there, something like this, a table there, and a few people there asking questions about me. And I think it was about 5 minutes discussion. And then they sent me home. I thought it was that we were having appendix out.
They told me they were taking my appendix out. The eugenics board had to give approval. 5 minutes in their office and we were out of there. It took 5 minutes for them to decide to wreck our lives.
You know, they took control of our body and they did it, and they didn't ask us. It was scary because the doors were always locked, and you just go like this and you bang, doors shut. There was a lot of things that went on there that Shouldn't have, you know.
So Rob, thanks again to you and your colleagues for an amazing film. And I'm just curious, what drew you into this topic in the first place?
Well, as Marcy mentioned in the introduction, one of the things that I teach and do research in is the philosophy of biology. And I actually teach a course called Biology, Society, and Values regularly. I used to teach at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, just south of Chicago. And I taught the course there, and I continued to teach that when I moved up to Alberta. And my main focus there when I covered eugenics as a part of getting people to think about the social context in which genetic knowledge and genetic technologies get used was to talk about the American eugenics movement and to talk about the Nazi eugenics movement. But once I got to Alberta, I found that the topic wasn't quite as distanced from me as you might hope.
So say more. When you say that when you got to Alberta, the topic wasn't as distant, what are you speaking to specifically?
Well, one of the first things that I discovered in teaching one of the courses, it was really a big learning experience between the Tuesday and the Thursday class for me, was we were talking about eugenics, and one of the students put up their hand and said, "Oh yeah, I know about this because my aunt was sterilized." I said, what do you mean? And it turned out that that was the beginning of a discovery process for me. There were a number of students who had relatives who were still living in the Edmonton area who had been sterilized under eugenic legislation, which was in place in Alberta until 1972, which is very late. And that led me to probe a little bit deeper about this history, which I had no idea of.
Yeah, and that's interesting to me because the experience I have in terms of having conversations with people about American eugenics is they think about it as something of the past, but your work suggests that these ideas are, in many cases, alive and well. So tell me a little bit more about the project and the various different elements, and also how it came about. I think that would be great to.
Yeah, so I think it's actually a bit of a continuation of that process of discovery for me. So this is around 2000, 2001, and so I asked more questions. I went back to my department immediately and said, "Hey, do you guys know anything about this Alberta eugenics stuff?" And they said, "Yeah, we do actually." And the short version of the conversation that followed was, we know quite a bit because the founding chair of our very own department, the Department of Philosophy, was also the chairman of the eugenics board for most of its history. And this is a history that stretched from 1928 until 1972. He was also the longest serving provost in the university's history. His name was John McCachran. And I was just blown away by this. It was right home, and I had arrived just after there had been a lot of public media attention directed at the case because of Leilani Muir's lawsuit against the province.
Now that lawsuit took place, I believe, in 1996. Is that correct? I know in.
Yeah, the decision was rendered in 1996.
Yeah, it was actually interesting enough. The Sterilization of Leilani Muir was one of the first films in Facing History's lending library that I accessed to begin to wrap my head around this history. So what are some of the other elements of the project? We're going to focus on the film, but I know the project has other legs. I'd love for you to at least blow that out a little bit, and we can come back to it later.
Yeah, so I think it was partly because there were a lot of people like me who didn't really know much about this history. I didn't know much about it because I just arrived, but it turned out that within a few years, although I was teaching a classroom of students, many of whom had heard about it in 2000, 2001, because of the proximity to the Leilani Muir case, which was very much under public scrutiny. Within a few years, that knowledge had disappeared, and I was just stunned. I thought, this is what happens. That all of a sudden, within 2 or 3 years, you've got the next batch of students coming through who don't know their own history. And so I started to try and look at how we might articulate a large-scale project that preserved that history and made it live for people, and hence the idea of what we called a living archives on eugenics. So the project was called Living Archives on Eugenics in Western Canada, which was involved in putting together a team of 30 or 40 people, at the center of which were the sterilization survivors themselves. We thought it was very important to tell this history through their eyes and through the power of the stories that only they could tell. So that became the beginning of a project. It took a few years to get some large-scale funding, and then the project itself ran from 2010 to 2015. But we were working together actively. They were visiting my classes. They were interacting with other people in other venues to share these stories in very powerful ways before we got the project underway.
So what was it like to get to know and to continue to get to know many of the folks who are featured in your film, people who have survived eugenics?
Well, it was a great honor to be able to and privilege to get to know them as people, and to realize, as I think I say at one point in the film, that really they're pretty much just like ordinary people, not what might be provoked by a stereotype of people who'd been classified as mentally defective and deemed to constitute some kind of menace to society sufficient for them to be segregated institutionally and for them to be sterilized. And so it involved a bit of undoing one's own, as much as one can at short notice, one's own prejudices and one's own biases, and to think, well, how did this happen? How did so many people who can perfectly well articulate their own story and talk about the injustices that were visited upon them and the downstream effects, how could they come to be classified in these ways? And this practice continued for so long in Alberta, as it did in at least a handful of American states as well, until the late 1960s, early 1970s, way after people realized what had the full extent that forms of eugenics could take through when they found out about the Nazi atrocities at the end of the Second World War. These practices still went on, and they were very actively, the laws were actively enforced in Alberta right through until the very end, until the law was repealed in 1972. So that was a real sort of puzzle, and meeting people and talking with them and hanging out with them who had been subject to this just deepened that kind of puzzle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, sort of this idea of untangling one's biases. And I think one of the legacies of eugenics I'm most fascinated with is this: it creates a taxonomy of human value or worth, marking people by virtue of their perceived fitness and then, treating them accordingly. And the tendency, at least the patterns that I observe, are those who are deemed to be less fit are deprived resources, in some cases institutionalized, oftentimes sterilized, and a host of other transgressions that are visited upon people. So in your process of interviews, were there some interviews that you found particularly compelling, thought-provoking, or tragic? I mean, I think they're all tragic in some extent, but would there be some interviews that really stand out in your mind?
Yeah, so maybe just to clarify a little bit about the process, and it tells you a little bit about how university research is done, because this was classified as research with a public outreach component. The interviews were actually done by our lead community partner, who's also one of the directors of the film, Nicola Fairbrother, and they were filmed by Jordan Miller. And I didn't actually get to see, I wasn't involved in that interview process because they were subject to a very strict control in terms of who could see. Even as the project director, I didn't get to see the interviews until they were done with the final product. And that's partly because we were working with people who, under the label of vulnerable individuals, vulnerable populations of individuals, and we wanted to make sure that if there were things in those stories that they didn't want in the final version, that they had complete control of that, and that their privacy was protected. And so we ended up with a series of these interviews that got down to about 10 or 12 minutes in that process. And then we started to think about what we would do with those a couple of years ago. And that's actually how the film came about. We didn't set out to make a film. We have the full stories that are preserved on the website under the Our Stories module that's there. And I really encourage people to look at them in full and with all the integrity that they're there, which to some extent I think is lost in the film, because now we're blending together the different stories to tell a bigger story about eugenics in Alberta. So I'm not sure if I really answered your question there. I got a little bit off track, but feel free to follow up.
No, so sort of going back to interviews, I have had the opportunity to see many of them in full length, and they're particularly powerful. And I'm wondering, are there some that stood out more for you as you've had a chance to work with them? Are there some that, and that's not to rank them or order them necessarily, but I think some of the comments and the experiences to me were particularly profound. And I wonder if you had a similar experience.
Yeah, I think each of them has something special in them. I mean, part of what they share is that they really are the person's own view of their story and what they want to highlight. And there are lots of things that we hadn't expected. One thing that came out, for example, in Ken Nelson's story was this story of how he met his wife, which was in a car accident just down the road from where I live, actually. And it's told in a very funny, jovial way. And to me, that's a really important sort of episode because it reminds you of how human, fully human, everybody involved here is. They've had their own ups and downs. Not everything is about the practice of, having been institutionalized and sterilized. It's not all glum and drum. But definitely there are some very dark moments in those interviews. In Lilani Muir's interview, and you'll see this in the film, or you'll remember it from the film from having seen it. And I hope others will have an opportunity to see the film as well. Lilani talks about not only not being told that she was sterilized and finding out when she's trying to have children many years later that she had been sterilized, and then trying to figure out, well, how did that happen? Because she didn't know as a teenager that had happened. But then finding that her adoption falls through as well. She tries to adopt children, and it falls through because she had been institutionalized and classified as a mental defective. And so she was deemed to be incapable of intelligent parenthood. And that was, as she says in the film, a big black mark against her. So it's not just about the physical wrongs that are done on the body and taking away the reproductive capacity, but it's really taking away the capacity in our current social context to parent in a much broader sense and all that comes with that. Family life. Judy talks about the opportunity to be in a family having been taken away from her. And that has consequences for the rest of somebody's life, not just for some moment that they pass through.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, these idea of ranking and ordering human value can impoverish one's sense of possibility. And I think for me, that's one of the things that's both chilling and fascinating about this history. So one of the things you said earlier about this, the quick erasure of memories is also an interesting thing. How can something that was so pervasive on a global level, in some cases, be excised from our public memory? And one of the things that struck me about your film and the larger project is that it's very consistent with some of the principles of transitional justice, which is basically this notion of how these societies repair themselves after episodes of genocide or collective violence, and what are the tools and mechanisms that they use. Many of them address issues of historical memory or historical understanding. So you could look at a constellation of tools which might include institutional reform, education, cultural responses, judicial processes, truth commissions, reparations, restitution, and reconciliation. And I'm struck by your film in that it touches on so many of those. And I'm wondering whether that was intentional or whether that was just an outgrowth of the project. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, most of the things that we did weren't really intentional. We had some big ideas about where we might go with various things. And as I said earlier, the film actually wasn't on our map. It wasn't something we set out to do. But something that Nicola Fairbrother has come back to a number of times when she's talked about this is important here, I think, is that people with intellectual disabilities or thought to have intellectual disabilities are amongst the very most marginalized people in our societies. I think this is true of the US as it is of Canada. They're people who really aren't given space to have a voice at all. So part of the power, I think, in a transitional justice project here is to literally get them on the map and to have their voices heard. And so what's different about this case than maybe some other cases that might come to mind with under the idea of transitional justice is that you kind of need to create the awareness that there's a problem in the first place. And it's interesting, there was a story just last night that broke on the CBC, the big national network in Canada, about an Aboriginal woman who had been sterilized against her will 5 years ago in Saskatchewan. And she was somebody who was a recovering drug addict who had already had 6 children. Now, the story itself, and people could go and look at the CBC website to find it, has its own kind of horror, partly because it mentions that it's not an isolated case, and the other cases that she knew of also involved Indigenous women. And it happened 5 years ago. We're not talking about something that happened in the distant past. But if you also go onto the CBC site, you'll see the comments from people. And many of those comments reflect exactly the kinds of eugenic attitudes that we might think of as part of this distant past. And so their comments that, well, she already had 6 children she couldn't look after. She was a drug addict. She had it coming to her. I mean, comments you just might think came from 40 or 50 years ago, but they came yesterday in Canada. And I think that's kind of shocking as well. So I think that part of the beginning of what has to happen is there has to be a dialogue around those continuing attitudes, especially around intellectual disability and other people who were exactly the sorts of people who were targeted by explicit eugenic policies.
Yeah, I've seen similar patterns here, so I think it is interesting, and it strikes me that it might be very difficult to interrogate one's biases without understanding where those ideas come from. It's almost they are the assumptive foundations, so they're givens rather than things that we need to be interrogating with some intentionality. So one thing that I was struck by is the power in people being able to tell their stories, to be given their voice back, and in many respects their humanity back. And I'd love it if you could just spend a moment speaking about what it's been like to work with some of these folks like Glenn or Leilani as you rolled out this work, and how do you see that affecting them on a personal level?
Well, I think one thing that it's done that's very positive is it's built a small but very important community. One of the things they had taken away from them was they don't have regular school friends because they were in this provincial training school and they were isolated from one another. Leilani and Judy did know each other, and it was actually the court case and the 800 or so cases that were settled out of court by the province in the wake of Leilani's trial that brought a number of these people back together to some extent. But they didn't have a more sustained community that they were a part of. And so this helped them to get to know one another. Even a number of them were in the institution at the same time and kind of knew of each other but hadn't had contact for 30 or 40 years. And so that's been one of the nice things, is to build that community and also to bridge that with the university community and to see them as true collaborators. And they are massively empowered by being taken seriously. Glenn has his whole, you may remember in the film, he walks around often with and is very proud of his collection of photographs, which are labeled in detail that tell his own story. And again, because this is a story that's sort of buried and there are many insights that you can only get from the survivors themselves, it's invaluable. And letting him know and others know that what you've provided here is just invaluable in terms of the knowledge that we want to preserve and getting people to try and understand. Your presence is invaluable in terms of interacting with students and other community members to share those experiences. I think that's been empowering and that's been valuable, and they feel very strongly about continuing to be in the public eye to some extent to raise awareness. And as Leilani says in the film, she'll go to the end of the earth to make sure this never happens again. Unfortunately, it is happening again, even just in very recent years, as the short story I just told indicates.
So I know we're about to transition shortly, but let's see if we can't get in maybe one more quick exchange. And I'm wondering about whether or not you see connections to contemporary forms of eugenics, whether we're talking about prenatal screening, distinctions between better or worse people, certain traits, or even the revelations about sterilizations taking place in California prisons just recently. How do you see the connections between the work you're doing and some of these patterns that we see emerging as we're beginning to engage with technologies that in the past didn't exist but now exist? So how do we forge those connections?
Yeah, so I think within the disability community, there's a lot of awareness around genetic screening technologies and their selective use to sort of target fetuses that have been diagnosed potentially with a disabling condition that might materialize way down the track. So, for example, screening for trisomy 21, which is widespread which corresponds to Down syndrome. There's a lot of awareness around that. That's a prominent example. And so there's been a lot of discussion around that, and I think the Center for Genetics and Society has been at the forefront of raising awareness around those kinds of issues. And it was very much more than on our minds, it was built into the fabric of the project. We have a number of interviews with people who are parenting around issues of disability, whether they are parents with disability or struggling with issues around potential disability for their children down the track. And those interviews are up on the website. They're not in the film because we initially made a film that had them, but it was 80 or 90 minutes long, and we really need to have a film that could be shown in a standard kind of classroom time. So that's why the film's at about 45 minutes, and we're hoping that we will have a second film that focuses around this very contemporary issue of parenting around disability, because I think it's easy to elicit those attitudes about who should and shouldn't have children, who can and can't have children. And anybody who's kind of falling from and deviating from standard sorts of social norms is likely to be subject to the same kinds of attitudes that drove explicit sterilization policies in the past. And so I think there's sometimes direct connections with ongoing sterilization practices. You mentioned Californian prison sterilizations, which were almost exclusively, if not exclusively, directed at Latina and African American women, not accidentally, I think. There's a case in Australia around the same time that was subject to a Senate inquiry that involved over 150 girls and women with intellectual disabilities who had been sterilized, many of them without their knowledge, which they uncovered through looking at Medicaid records. And this is in the last couple of years. So sterilization itself is not something of the past. And we do need to be very vigilant about the more implicit or tacit forms of eugenics that sometimes are brought up under Troy Duster's. I see that great poster on celebrating Troy Duster behind you, phrase eugenics. So we do need to be very much aware of those. But even the old practices aren't simply a matter of the past. It's kind of stunning.
In many ways, the past is quite frankly present. So we're about to make a transition and to allow people that are listening, that are participating online to begin to populate the question and answer box with some of the questions. I'd love to be able to bring people into the conversation. So let's take a break for a moment and allow people to serve some questions up, and then we'll come back at it in a moment.
Okay, thank you, Milton, and thank you, Rob. Yeah, this pause here is really an opportunity to encourage all of you who are listening and watching to weigh in with your own questions and comments by typing them into that Q&A box that you see at the bottom right of your screen there. It's also an opportunity for me to share with you some of the rich resources that are available through the organizations and the projects that are represented on this in this conversation today. So what you see on your screen now are some links that we'll again be sending you in an email after this event, and you can find out more about Rob and about the film, about the Eugenics Archive, which was mentioned and which is a real treasure of resources and to explore and to share with others, students and colleagues and friends. And then also we will send you links to information about Milton and about Facing History and Ourselves, another really important and amazing organization. On the Center for Genetics and Society website, we have special sections devoted to eugenics, to disability, and to human rights, all especially relevant to the topics that we're talking about today. We also want to invite you to help the Center for Genetics and Society bring you conversations like this one and support the other projects that we're involved in. And we invite you to join us by subscribing to our newsletter, by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and actually the Twitter feed for this conversation is quite lively, and to visiting our website and our blog, which we refresh every week with new commentary, and several times a week with new news articles about issues related to.
We've got a few questions, and I'm hoping that as we continue our conversation, some more questions will show up in the Q&A box. But one of the ones we'll start out with is one from, looks like Naman Bendra. And the question is, do you support prenatal screening and the new technology to prevent early disability and diseases?
That's a great question, and I don't think it's a sort of straightforward yes or no question. And I say that not to be evasive. I think it's a complicated question. We live in a world now in which reproductive autonomy is something that's largely taken for granted, and I think rightly so. People, and women in particular, have the right to control their bodies. That said, the question to ask, I think, about the use of those technologies, particularly to prevent disability and disease, is about the selective use of those technologies and about why it might matter sufficiently that somebody have the potential to have, even a minority chance of having, a certain kind of condition in light of a test that we would class as a disability, so take Down syndrome, that it be sufficient to terminate that pregnancy. And I think people should reflect on the selective use of abortion to terminate pregnancies, for example, in light of diagnostic testing that's been done, in the way in which, if they thought about the use of it to terminate, for example, somebody who was going to be female as opposed to male, why would that be sufficient? Even if that person's life might well be disadvantaged because of the social circumstances that they're born into. Why might you feel uncomfortable about that, for example, about the practice, say, of using gender as the basis for this kind of prenatal screening with termination? But you're not uncomfortable about doing that, for example, with respect to trisomy 21, or with somebody who might have a late onset condition like Huntington's disease or chorea, as it's called. And I think it's really going to be largely up to individuals, given where we're at with respect to reproductive autonomy, as opposed to, say, where we were 50 or 60 years ago. And it's not an easy issue to resolve.
Great, thank you. So Kyle, who I think is a member of your team, has surfaced a question that he's struck by the fact that eugenics is still happening, and how do we go about focusing on prevention of these ideas or these practices? What do you think are useful strategies in regards to preventing the reemergence or the backdoor to eugenics, as Troy Duster has framed it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I really believe that you can't prevent people from having these ideas surface, but you can engage people in constructive dialogues and get them to go through some sort of critical thinking about the attitudes that they've absorbed and what they lead to and what they're connected with, and why they might treat one situation in one way and another situation that's very parallel. That was what I was trying to gesture at in the previous example, in a very different way, and think about their own biases. Think about, for example, the extent to which having a particular disability is in some sense really intrinsic to that kind of condition, or it's more of a function of the social environments in which that we create that systematically disempower people with particular sorts of disabilities. So, the most obvious kinds of examples involve mobility and things like wheelchair access. People's lives can be massively improved by changing the social circumstances in which they live, not getting rid of those people or preventing their birth. So I don't know. I think the way to change the practices is to change the underlying ideas, and you can't dictate the change of the underlying ideas. I think you ultimately have to appeal to some kind of reason and dialogue, and maybe that's where the process of transitional justice plays a really important role, is to engage people in the broader community more generally around those discussions. And I think that's been central to our project.
No, that's great. So it actually connects back to a question that Marcy surfaced earlier, and I'm going to go to that, and then we're going to tie back into Vasiliki's question, because I think it's a good extension of that. But Marcy's question is, in Alberta, survivors are still alive. And so what do you think can be done to unbury the history and the legacy of eugenic programs in places like California, where most of the people who were sterilized, at least in the first wave, are no longer with us, right? So we've got this tension between people who may no longer be able to tell their stories, and sadly the emerging reality that there are some. But how do we deal with the histories and legacies in ways that are generative and move that conversation forward that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that survivors, as I said earlier, provide just a completely unique perspective that is undervalued within the academic community on this kind of phenomenon. But it is true. I mean, it's not true that there aren't survivors in the US, because in some of the states the practice has continued on, and as we indicated with the California prison system, some of them are going on kind of now, and you you can, access might be restricted, but you can engage those people in discussions and see how interested they are in telling their stories. I mean, they have to overcome a lot of shame. You may have to overcome legal obstacles and barriers and so on. And of course, there are vested interests in not having those stories told, but you can do that. But when you don't have that, I think it's a little bit more restrictive and a bit harder because there's such a power in those stories. And so in some sense, I mean, I don't want to quite say we're in a fortunate situation in Alberta, but, you know, we did have people who they'd already been through these legal cases, so to some extent they had to face up to that sort of very unpleasant history and some of the scrutiny that goes on, and some of the pushback in the general community where we did public events early on where people would say, yeah, they should still be sterilizing these people. And it was kind of shocking from where we sat to hear that, but they were the views, and they are the popular and common views that are out there. So I think that there's ways to engage people now. Partly it's through thinking about people who are in parallel situations, even if they're not subject to explicit eugenic sterilization laws, but are still face very much the same forms of discrimination and are subject to the same kinds of attitudes. And so thinking about people who are incredibly marginalized through drugs and alcohol, through historical practices of oppression, say through, for example, in Canada, the residential school system, which systematically took children away from their parents in order to engage in some kind of very misguided civilizing mission. And, you know, as people on our team have characterized, instituted a kind of cultural eugenics. Talk to people about that kind of experience as well, and think about the connection between that explicit eugenic past and some of these ongoing practices that aren't as far removed as you might think. So that would be one way into that in other parts of the world where there's something like this.
Yeah, it reminds me of the work going on in North Carolina around reparations. Marie Tamer Pena's new film, No Mas Baby. So there are opportunities to have these conversations with people who are still around to tell their stories. So Vasiliki asked a question, and I think it's great because we'll give you an opportunity to speak to the suite of tools and the website. But the question is, do you have any information about eugenics going on in Europe or other parts of the world? And I think I'd love for you to speak about that Globe feature on the Living Archives. It's an amazing transnational analysis of these ideas. So can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so part of what we want to do is we have a very special situation and story to be told focused on Alberta and Western Canada more generally that's unknown to many Canadians. And we think other people will have an interest in that story as well. But of course, we want to locate that partly in the broader eugenics movement, including the historical eugenics movement, but also connection to practices that we might think of as being eugenic enough or eugenic sufficiently like past eugenic practices to at least put them in parallel and think about it. So then we have a feature called, I think it's called World or The World, with a globe, and you can spin around the globe around and click on countries that are highlighted to see what either has gone on in the past or what is going on now. And so I know one of the things that you'll find if you go on there is you'll find that in countries where there were Roma populations, there have been relatively recent practices of sterilization in Central Europe. And I know I was actually in Budapest last year talking about this, and that was a very live issue then. Exactly how documented these things are, and there's a lot of things that are unknown. But you've got people. I was told that when I was giving the talk, we might have Roma women coming, and it might get very political and overt. And it didn't turn out like that at the end, but that was the current situation there. So you often go somewhere where you don't expect to find a connection, and there is a connection. I know when we were in Sweden, the Scandinavian countries had practiced eugenic sterilization quite late, and that was only revealed in the 1990s, and people in the Scandinavian countries, like Canadians, were kind of horrified to hear of this part of their history that they didn't know about. So some of that is still historical, but it's also connected, I think, in some cases with ongoing practice. Some people would say that the one-child policy, as it was implemented in China, for example, where it was disproportionately implemented depending on your kind of status in society. So if you were more marginalized, you'd be more likely to be subject to it in poor rural communities, for example, than in some other communities. you might see that as akin to a kind of eugenics, although it's not articulated explicitly as a eugenic policy. And again, we really, I think in constructing the project and the website, we really want to, obviously we're not trying to make up people's minds for them. We want to give them the information that gets them to think about these cases in a sort of deeper way than they would usually. And that includes a whole variety of people across our community, from high school students through to university students through to people who might be in retired communities thinking about discussion groups and issues that really matter to their communities, a whole variety of people. So we try to make the website as accessible.
Yeah, you did a great job. It's, as many of my friends and colleagues know, I'm not always that enamored with tech, but I have to say I'm blown away by the site that you've created. It's both accessible, it paints a complex picture and a global picture, which I think is particularly useful in broadening our understanding of the not just the history of of the eugenics movement, but its ongoing legacy. So thank you for developing a great site. So let's see if we can't try to get to a couple more questions in the next 8 minutes or so. Shri services a question: what about fetal reduction when women have IUI or IVF and multiple pregnancies? Should that be permitted?
Fetal reduction itself need not be eugenic, but if you start to use the distinction between, so if you did it sort of randomly and decided we don't want to give birth to so many children, well, you need to choose one too, that would be one thing. But once you start to use the so-called indicative conditions for what might likely emerge, just as if you use sex, you can start to see that as being much more closely allied to past eugenic practices. And again, I would just get people in the first instance to notice that and to think hard about where those attitudes come from. Why would having what some people themselves don't experience as an intrinsically disabling condition, even something like blindness, for example, if you talk with people who are blind or people who are deaf, these are cases that often come up, many of them they experience themselves as being excluded from society, as not having the same opportunities, but it's not because of the condition itself. And I think we need to take those kinds of perspectives much more seriously when we're trying to make informed parental sorts of decisions in the use of these technologies. So it might just seem natural, of course, it must be worse to be blind or to be deaf than to be seeing or to be hearing. But that's actually something that should be much more critically examined in light of particularly the views of people in exactly that sort of position, say, from birth. And I think once you open yourself to those discussions, it can be quite earth-shattering in terms of your own.
Just a quick connection. The Paul K. Longmore Institute has a Patient No More exhibit about the fight for the 504. And what's been fascinating is the way in which it's broadened conversations away from viewing people, I think, with a deficit lens to understanding a spectrum of a diversity of ways in which we're abled. And so moving away from what people are lacking to understanding the ways in which people are differently abled is an important conversation. It's the kind of complication I think you're speaking to. I think we might be able to sneak in one or two more questions if we're pretty tight with it. So Vasiliki serves up another one. What do you think about the very sophisticated genetic technologies like genetic editing technologies? And can they be used for what might be defined as eugenic purposes? And I know that CRISPR and there's a lot of things sort of in conversation right now. So I don't know if you can give a tight answer to that, but would love to get your...
I think the short answer is yes, of course they can be, and people are particularly concerned now with so-called germline modifications. And they have been for a long time, but the technologies are coming on. They're much more of a reality now than they were, say, 10 years ago. And I think people do need to seriously think about the use of those technologies in the context.
Okay, so let me see if we can't blend these last couple questions together that I've got. So Paige is serving up a question. Internationally, how much of eugenic sterilization is related to animus? And then going back to another question, let's actually deal with that one of animus. And, how much of this is related to racial animus? And I'd like to weigh in on that just a touch as well. So please.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you want to weigh in first? I think that often, I don't know about the animus, but certainly with respect to race more generally, when people think about eugenics, they often do think about race being very prominent, and certainly in parts of the United States, it's prominent. I think it's actually not as prominent globally in the States. So, for example, if you take somewhere like North Carolina, the initial set of sterilizations that were done through the 1930s and 1940s, and even into the 1950s, were not targeted around race. Race wasn't a prominent kind of variable, but it became used when the civil rights movement took off to really target African Americans much more. So it's very much, the policy was very much subject to what was going on sort of locally in American society at the time. In Canada, race was used perhaps indirectly. Sort of ethnicity might be a better way to think of it. It might be better to think about race in terms of ethnicity overall anyway. Certainly Indigenous women in particular were disproportionately targeted. Recent immigrants were targeted. And the classic kind of case of the Nazis, we know that Jewish people or people of Jewish ancestry were targeted as well, but not exclusively. The Nazis started off with their T4 program, kind of practicing their euthanasia techniques on eugenic grounds and testing out the gas chambers on 400,000 people with disabilities. So I think it's hard to generalize. I mean, unless you have a very fluid notion of race. So Roma people now, I mentioned those earlier. Is that race? Is it ethnicity? Is it just sort of people who are very much at the margins of society, who don't have a kind of foothold, who are transient?
So briefly, the way I respond to it is I look back at the earlier part of the century, I see the words nation and race being used synonymously. So I think about the modern nation state as conceived as a biological or a racial community, and that has implications for people who are deemed as various different degrees of fitness. And the deeper I move into this, it seems less that animus is not a necessary driver, right? Animus is not a requirement for engaging around these sets of ideas, and I think that's what makes him so provocative and stimulating intellectually. We're right up on the edge of the hour, and I know we've got to stop on time, so I want to thank you, Rob. I want to thank the participants who joined in the conversation. I apologize for not being able to get to all the questions, but I think we got to a fair number of them. So I'm going to hand us back over to Marcy, and I'm going to sign off. But thanks again, Rob, for an engaging conversation. Thanks for your work.
Hey, thanks, Bob. It's great talking to you. Yeah.
All right. I just wanted to thank both of you for a really, really interesting and provocative conversation, and also thank the participants who gave us some really wonderful questions. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to them all, and maybe we can get to a few via email afterwards. And just to remind all of you, we're going to end in just a few seconds here, and we'll take you to a screen that will have some questions on it about the Talking Biopolitics series and this event. And we would really welcome your feedback and your suggestions for future Talking Biopolitics conversations. One that will be coming up next year is about the film that was mentioned in the conversation, No Mas Bebés, about the experience of coerced sterilizations after the state-sponsored program. This was not under a state program, but just took place in county hospitals. So there are lots of dots to connect here. I thought Milton and Rob, you did a great job of connecting a lot of them, as well as from the questions from the other participants. So thanks to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.
Take care.
Bye.